In this lecture, I would like to challenge an important and commonly held view about strategy. Many entrepreneurs, many companies believe that being first is crucial. You have to be first to market. They believe there's tremendous advantage from being first to market. Is that true? Should we believe that conventional wisdom? That's what I'd like to look at in this lecture. What do we mean by first mover advantage? We mean the competitive advantage established by virtue of the fact that a company has entered a market first and established a position. And yes, first movers sometimes do achieve tremendous advantage. Let's take a few examples. Gillette in razors, Sony in portable stereos with its Walkman product, Coca-Cola in carbonated soft drinks, Hoover in vacuum cleaners. Each of those firms was first to market in their category or early to market in their category, and they seem to achieve a tremendous advantage by being early to market. But it's not always the case that first movers win. We certainly do have plenty of examples of first movers who did not succeed, or even who ended up completely out of the market. Who was the first, or at least one of the very early players in social media? It was not Facebook. It was a company called Friendster, one many of you may not even recall. What about the first mover in VCRs, video cassette recorders? That would be Sony. But they bet on beta, and VHS became the technological standard. Sony did not become the winner, despite being the first mover. What about the first mover in internet retailing? Do you remember eToys? They were very early, moving to the web and offering products without any physical stores. What about internet browsers? Do you remember Netscape? Search. Was Google first? No, they were not. One study, in fact, showed that pioneers were more successful than late movers in just 15 of 50 product categories. That is what research coming out of the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern has shown. First mover advantage. Where does it come from? What are the causes of the situations where first movers do have advantage? Well, there are four major things that we can think about that help incumbents have advantage. Economies of scale, economies of scope, network effects, and learning effects. We're going to talk about each of those in turn. Let's delve into them a bit. What does it mean for a firm to have economies of scale? What does it mean to have a learning advantage? What is a network effect? And might there also be some source of first mover advantage from preempting access to scarce resources or assets? So maybe you get the key locations or talented employees or key suppliers first. So these are all potential sources of first mover advantage. If scale matters, if learning matters, if network effects matter, and if getting access to key assets is key. All of those might be the basis for first mover advantage. What do we mean by economies of scale? Economies of scale exist in a business when the cost per unit to produce and distribute that good fall as you produce more units of the good in any given time period. So the bigger, the better. The larger you are, the more your cost per unit come down. That's what we mean by economies of scale. And we can think of a number of businesses where such scale economies are pronounced. Toyota in the automobile business, right? Their size and scale enables them to have lower costs of production than smaller firms. Bank of America in commercial banking. There are certain efficiencies that come from being a large nationwide and global financial institution. So, or even FedEx, for example, which operates a logistics company. Again, there's huge technological investments and infrastructure investments in that business. And anytime you see these huge investments that have to be made, these very high fixed costs, well, the higher your volume, the more you're able to amortize those fixed costs over many units and bring your cost per unit down. That's what we mean by economies of scale. Well, what about the learning curve? How is that different, a learning curve effect, from a scale effect? Well, in the case of a learning curve, what you have is, again, cost per unit falling, but this time not because you produce more units today, but because you've been producing this good over some extended period of time. And over time, you've become more experienced at producing this good. You've learned how to do it more efficiently, and so your costs per unit fall over time. They fall as the total number of units you've ever produced continues to grow. And we see this, for example, in the submarine manufacturing business. One of my first jobs in the private sector was at General Dynamics, maker of the Trident, 688, and Seawolf submarines when I was there. And what we learned as we were projecting our costs on future submarine contracts is we knew there was a significant learning curve. When we produced the first Trident submarine, the cost to produce that was quite high. But our workers became more and more familiar with the boat, and they were able to bring costs down on each subsequent ship. We learned. Our experience gave us great benefit. So whether it's economies of scale or learning curves, in each case, the incumbent has the advantage. If you can get in there first, you can bring your costs down because you can get bigger faster and you can get more experience faster before other players enter the business. But there's another key source of competitive advantage, of first mover advantage that we need to discuss. And that's what we call network effects. This one is less understood, perhaps, by many business people than the issues of scale economies or learning curves. Network effects have less to do with cost and more to do with the perceived value on the part of the user. What is a network effect? It's when the value per user rises as the total number of users rises. So let's think for a moment about buying a refrigerator. Does the value to me of a particular brand of refrigerator, is it at all dependent on whether lots of other people buy that particular brand of refrigerator? The answer is largely not, right? The value to each user of that particular refrigerator is independent of how many people use that refrigerator. But now let's think about some other products and services. Let's think about eBay, LinkedIn, video games, Google, eHarmony, or Amazon. In each of these cases, the users of those products and services find that the value to each user rises as the number of users increases. Let's see if we can explain this with regard to eBay, because some may not understand quite why and how that works. eBay, of course, the online auction marketplace that has come to be very, very successful since the mid-1990s. Well, what is the value to each user of eBay? Well, let's think about a new online auction marketplace that was to come to be. Suppose an entrepreneur launched an online auction marketplace to compete with eBay. What would the value be to each user? Well, in the early days, with very few users, there'd be very little value to each customer. Why? Because each customer would look and say, this is only valuable to me if there are many other people with whom I can buy and sell goods. Without many other people with whom I can interact, this service, as pretty as the website may be and as cool as the branding campaign may be, this service isn't really valuable to me. But eBay, this is valuable to me. There's great value. Why? Because I can go on that site and find many other buyers and sellers. If I have an item that I'm looking to sell, there'll be lots of interested parties out there with whom I can transact. And hopefully, I can get a good price as a result. If I'm looking to buy, I'm hoping there's many sellers offering the same good, and I can look for the best price. So there's value to me as more users enter the network. This is also true with LinkedIn and other social media platforms. LinkedIn is a professional networking platform, social media platform for professionals in a variety of fields, including business. What's the value to me of using LinkedIn? Well, it rises significantly as many other colleagues in different institutions join the LinkedIn network. Because now I have people with whom I can share ideas, with whom I can network, with whom I can look for jobs, etc. Google. What's the network effect in the search business? Well, the more people that use Google, the more Google is able to refine its search algorithms. The more it learns and becomes smarter about being able to predict what each of us wants when we go to the site and try to search. So the more people that use the site, the smarter Google becomes, the more value to each of us of the site. And what about Amazon? Where is the network effect there? Well, many people go to Amazon and they review products that they've purchased. It began, of course, with their famous book reviews, but now there are reviews for a whole array of items that Amazon offers on its site. Well, the more people that go to Amazon, the more people review products and services, the more value to me of using Amazon as a service to buy goods. Why? Because more others using the site means more reviews, means more information for me as I try to decide which brand of that particular item that I'd like to purchase. So in each of these examples, the value to each user rises as more users come on board. Why then does this phenomenon lead to first mover advantage? Well, because presumably the first mover can gather lots of users, and as such, they can increase their value to each user, and that creates an advantage over the upstart who comes in with no users and has very little value to offer. So many of these new economy firms, many internet firms, who are in businesses where network effects exist, have pursued the so-called get big fast strategy. Get a lot of users to create that higher value per user. Ultimately, we'll find out how to make money later. Right now, let's build the network effect as a defense against others who choose to come in and try to compete with us. And this has been a powerful, powerful phenomenon with firms like Facebook or LinkedIn, with companies like eBay and Amazon. In markets with these network effects, you should note that typically there are high switching costs for users. And when switching costs are high, users encounter a lock-in effect. They're in effect stuck with a particular good or service or platform. From the perspective of the user, that may not be ideal. But from the perspective of a company offering a product or service, switching costs are a wonderful thing. You'd like your customer to be locked into you. Why are customers locked in to a firm like LinkedIn? Well, let's think about that for a moment. Are there high switching costs if you were to switch to another platform for professional networking? Well, of course there are, because if I switch, but none of my colleagues at my firm and other firms switch, well then what value is there to me of this new platform? So I have to be able to get all of my colleagues to switch as well. That's difficult. And recreating my new network, all those contacts, all those interconnections on a new platform, that's going to be very difficult. That's going to be time consuming. That's going to be inefficient. So the switching costs are high. It keeps me locked in to a firm like LinkedIn. And that's true with a number of platforms where network effects exist. What are the sources of these switching costs? Well, there are many sources. Let me just touch on a couple. First, if there are any durable purchases, if there's any equipment you must buy to use a particular product or service, that locks you in. So in the video game case, you buy a console to play a particular set of games. That console, whether it's the PlayStation or the Xbox, that's a durable purchase, and now that's locked you in to buying video games from that same company or its partners. Brand-specific training can be a source of lock-in. If you've had to do some training so that you know a particular service or a platform, and that of course creates switching costs. If there's specialized suppliers, that may also create switching costs. Or contractual commitments that you've had to make. Loyalty programs can create switching costs as well. If you have something where you've been rewarded for your loyalty, and you will continue to be, you may be reluctant to switch. All of these issues create lock-in and make it good for companies as they try to retain their customers. So, in some of these markets where strong network effects exist, not only is there a first mover advantage, but that first mover can come to be the dominant technology or firm. They can become the so-called standard in that market. We see that in certain cases, right? Microsoft with Windows becoming a dominant player with 90% market share in the operating system business. So not only did the network effects enable them to have first mover advantage, but they became the standard, almost completely dominating the market. But that's not always the case. Why is that? Because in certain products or services, while there may be strong network effects, there's also high demand for variety on the part of the customer. The customer doesn't want only one solution. And so one dominant standard doesn't come to prevail, but several standards come to coexist. So let's take video games. In video games, there are strong network effects, right? There is value to me if other people use the Sony PlayStation. I can share games with them. I can perhaps rent games more easily. I know that if others use the platform, then developers are more likely to build cool games for that platform. So there's definitely more value to me if more people use the same platform I'm using. network effects exist. But there's also high demand for variety. There's a wide array of people who play video games, from the casual gamer, the young children, to the hardcore gamer in their 20s, who's perhaps, the male living in their mother's basement playing video games. There are lots of different people with different tastes and preferences playing, and as a result, despite strong network effects, one player hasn't come to dominate the market, and right now we're looking at 3 players who coexist: Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo with its Wii family of products. So sometimes we see a dominant standard, but if there's high demand for variety and a really heterogeneous customer base, we may see multiple firms come to coexist, and the first mover alone doesn't win. Now this leads me to a really important point. Can we identify some characteristics of situations when first movers definitely have the advantage and others where perhaps not so much? Well, one framework has looked at the fact that market evolution and technological evolution, the speed at which both the market evolves and technology evolves, that has a great bearing on whether we'll see a standard or a dominant player who moved first see enduring advantage. So let's take a market where we've seen fairly slow evolution of both technology and the market itself, like Scotch tape, right? 3M creates a product, Scotch tape, very, very slow-moving space where they've been able to achieve first mover advantage, and it's endured. But in the personal computer business, where we've seen rapid technological obsolescence and lots of dynamic changes over time, much harder for someone to establish and maintain a first mover advantage. And this is really key. The notion that first movers don't always win, that the conventional wisdom is not correct, that there's a real downside to first mover advantage. Well, why? First and most importantly, there are high costs, in some cases, of blazing a new trail technologically. Some people call these pioneering costs. What does that mean? It means sometimes moving into an entirely new category with a product customers don't know anything about. Well, there's a lot of uncertainty there. There's a lot of education of the consumer that needs to take place. There's a lot of change that will happen early in that technology's existence. And so moving first can have its disadvantages, because those fast followers, the people who come in second and third, they can watch the mistakes you've made. They can learn from those, and they can catapult beyond you. They can take advantage of the fact that you've blazed the trail and then move quickly to supersede you. There's also a problem, though, that you make certain commitments when you move first. Those commitments, as we've noted, can become rigid, and it can become hard for you to change. If you've had success as a first mover initially, you can become complacent or experience organizational inertia and not be able to change as the market begins to evolve. And finally, there's the sunk cost trap. The bottom line is you begin to invest in a particular technology, in a particular way of doing business. You're the first mover. And now even if you start to get negative feedback, you can't cut your losses and shift strategy. Instead, you're beholden to what you've already invested, and you throw good money after bad. You become overcommitted to your initial course of action because of all the emotion and the money and the effort you've put into it. That sunk cost trap definitely inhibits many first movers from adapting as markets evolve. And it's why second movers come in and supersede them in many cases. Pioneering a new category can be expensive. And it's really interesting to watch how second movers, often large firms, but are agile enough, they have money, they have resources, but they have agility, they can come in and pass you by. There's a great quote from Greg Carpenter, who's a researcher in this field, who's shown that second movers often do better than first movers. He said a lot of times pioneers are not very well funded. They create a competitive game, and then they're unable to dominate it. Their resources are just too limited. So competitors enter quickly, and with more resources are able to win the game that the pioneer has created. We see this in many situations, right? Where eToys comes in, they're an entrepreneurial upstart, they see the future, they know retailing on the web is going to be a dominant trend, but they don't really have the resources, they don't have it all figured out, so they pioneer the way, but then others pass them by. Well, when should you pioneer? When is it that that may be the right strategy? Well, if the expected life of a product category is very short, then being first may be important, because if there's only a short time window, let's take advantage of it. If the value of the product is highly subjective or intangible, it may be important to be the first mover, right? If brand matters a lot and establishing that brand because the product is somewhat intangible and its perceived value is very subjective. And finally, if the cost of imitation is high, why might it be high? Well, if there's patents or other barriers that second movers will face, if you can protect intellectual property, then the cost of imitating will be high. And so being first can have tremendous advantage. And maybe then you should pioneer. But first movers don't always win, and in part it's because they overestimate the importance of economies of scale, learning curves, and network effects. All those things that are sources of first mover advantage, sometimes we over-attribute success to those sources of advantage. We rely on them too much, and therefore we think that being first will lead to great performance and sustainable advantage. Let's think about economies of scale for a moment. I would argue that managers often grossly overestimate the economies of scale in a business. Why? Well, costs per unit certainly do fall over time as volume increases in many businesses, whether it's automobile manufacturing or the logistics business at FedEx and others. But at some point, that curve begins to rise again. In other words, the cost per unit eventually start to rise again as you get too big, too complex, too bureaucratic. There is some point where bigger is no longer better, where eventually you've grown your organization to a point where there's some inefficiency that begins to be built in, and where smaller firms now have the advantage over you. Why do firms overestimate economies of scale? In many cases, they believe bigger is better because that has been true up to a point. So they believe it will continue to be true, and they don't see the limits of those economies. They don't see where it will begin to turn negative for them. If we look at General Motors in the automobile business, scale was a tremendous advantage for them for much of the 20th century. But eventually they became so big, so bureaucratic, so complex to manage that it became a liability. They became vulnerable because they weren't as flexible and nimble as other firms. Leaders like to lead large firms, right? They believe in the power of big if they're the incumbent player. And they don't realize sometimes the liabilities, the disadvantages they have relative to the upstart and the entrepreneur. Learning curves have an issue as well that we have to consider. Right? Learning curves can be a tremendous source of advantage, but what happens if we're in a situation where we can't hold all that learning tight, where we can't protect our intellectual property? Scholars call these spillover effects. What if the learning that we're achieving through experience, through being in the marketplace for some period of time and having produced it, we've become better and better at producing it over time? What if that learning spills out beyond the boundaries of our firm? And if that's the case, then being first no longer is as much of an advantage. The second mover can capture those spillovers, can learn from us, including from our mistakes, and pass us. This issue is particularly problematic in economies without strong intellectual property protection. So in Asia, in China, for example, where we don't have those laws that are able to protect the intellectual property, or if we're in situations where labor is very mobile and knowledge that's being created is not the type you can easily protect through patents, think Silicon Valley, for example. In these situations where we can't protect and hold proprietary what we've learned, the learning curve no longer becomes a source of first mover advantage. Now the second mover can grab that labor that's mobile, can grab that knowledge that can't be patented, or perhaps can even grab knowledge that's patentable because there aren't strong intellectual property protections built into the law. In each of those cases, the learning curve no longer conveys first mover advantage as much as it does in some cases where you can protect your intellectual property. You can keep learning proprietary. How about network effects? Surely that's the one where if they exist, it will always make sense to be first and to get in fast. Well, maybe not. I mean, let's think about social media, for example. If network effects are so crucial in that business, then how come Facebook came along and not only did it supplant early movers like Friendster, but it overwhelmed a company like MySpace as well? So even in a case where the network effect exists, and where lots of entrepreneurs believing these network effects exist are pursuing get big fast strategies, is it right? Are they correct? Well, Mieszek Piskorsky is a scholar who's looked at social media platforms in great detail. And he's looked and said sometimes there are certain networks where the customer actually prefers a non-crowded network. They don't want too many other users on the site. They want more users. There's value as others use the site, but as too many people use the site, the value starts to turn negative again. The example he gives is eHarmony. He says, we want to be on a dating platform where there are lots of others who post on the platform. We want a variety of other potential partners, but we don't want too many because eventually we run into competition. We want to date a certain person, but too many others want to date that person as well, and some of them may be more attractive to that other individual than we are. And so there's some limits to how many other users sometimes we want. Felix Oberholzer-Guy at Harvard has also looked at this issue of, might there be some downsides to the network effect? And he looked at why and how Friendster failed in social media and why Facebook survived. He said Friendster pursued a first-come, first-served strategy, trying to get big fast. They pursued customers around the world in both Asia and North America. But he said there was an interesting problem. The Asian users generally didn't really care much about being on the same network and interacting with US users and vice versa. So spending all the money to build two giant sets of individuals on the network in two different continents didn't actually add a lot of value. They might have done better if they just focused on building the network within one region than trying to expend all those resources to getting big fast across two regions. And that waste of resources made them vulnerable to others who came in and built a better platform with more focus in their strategy. Who was more focused? Facebook was. What did they do? Not only did Facebook focus on one region, but they also focused initially on one customer segment. How did Facebook begin? They began with someone at Harvard who took the physical Facebook that had pictures and backgrounds on all of the members of the first year class and putting that up on the web. And they began then, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder, began then creating this network for college students, people who had an email address that ended in edu. This focus created network effects, but in a bounded way. And Guy, in his scholarship on Friendster and its demise, has argued that indiscriminate growth often undermines the very network effects you're trying to achieve. And he would argue that's what happened at a firm like Friendster. The more focused strategy, still creating value as more users joined Facebook, but with some boundaries, was more successful. Are there lower switching costs today? Might there be less first mover advantage today than there was several decades ago in business? This is an interesting question that's been asked recently. As we see, incumbents get toppled much more readily, and firms face much shorter periods of time during which they're able to achieve advantage and hold on to it. Some have begun to ask, maybe it's just easier today to switch to a new rival, to a new upstart, and therefore first mover advantage is not as crucial, not as enduring as it once was. And this is some interesting scholarship by Ayal and Chowdhury, where they've argued that as we've moved to things like LinkedIn, where we can move our contacts very easily, where we can log in with universal logins and sign-ons across multiple platforms. As we begin to do this, what's happened is we're not as locked in. We can port our contacts from one platform to the other. We can move en masse with our friends from one platform to the other. We can have one profile that we can now use to log into multiple networks. As all of that's happened, we're facing a situation where it's easier to switch for customers, and we're not as locked in. And therefore, first movers have less of an advantage. Now, interestingly, one strategy for dealing with situations where network effects exist and where firms are trying to achieve first mover advantage, one strategy for that is what's been described as the freemium business model. Some firms give away their products for free, and then they have a premium offering for which people can pay. LinkedIn does this, for example. When does that make sense? Well, it makes sense if there are strong network effects. You're trying to build your network as fast as you can, but it only makes sense if also we know that there are low marginal costs for adding new users. If we can add new users without a lot of additional expense, then getting big fast and getting a lot of free people on the site and then trying to offer premium services, that makes sense. But if there are high marginal costs of adding new users, then you can cost yourself a lot of money and you can get deep in the red and perhaps even go bankrupt trying to get big fast. So freemium can be an effective strategy, but only if there are low marginal costs for adding new users coupled with those strong network effects. The lessons then. Think carefully about the pluses and minuses of pioneering versus being a fast follower. Understand the sources of first mover advantage and the limitations of those advantages. As an entrant or a follower, exploit the weaknesses in a pioneer's first mover status. In short, don't buy the conventional wisdom. Being first, being early, is not always as advantageous as we think it is. So now your assignment. Consider Boeing. Think about Boeing, one of the leaders in airplane manufacturing, and ask yourself, why did the firm have such powerful first mover advantage with regard to the jumbo jet business? What is it? What were the sources of advantage they had by being first? And then contrast that with personal digital assistants. Why were the early movers in the 1980s and early 90s, such as Apple's Newton product, why were they not successful? What happened that caused the first movers there not to have enduring advantage over time?